at that age, I think it's more about curiosity and experimentation,
It is at every age.
You think
age.
Older kids don't maybe, from my experience, a 13-year-old or 11-year-old are my kids' ages.
Uh-huh.
I know that they have like specific things that they're interested in, right? And then they choose or decide like, I want to get better at it.
I'm not saying that doesn't happen. That definitely happens. And I have some memories of doing that myself, of being like, I think I want to learn about this, and like going for it. So that does happen. I'm just saying that I don't think it's necessary for a child to know they're motivated and make a decision to learn in order for learning to happen.
Right. It doesn't have to be a conscious, like active process.
That's what I'm saying. Okay. It doesn't have to be like this conscious choice. And a lot of parents who are unschooling and they're maybe new to the unschooling and their children are young, they're waiting and they're looking and they're watching for their child to choose to learn something instead of recognizing that they're already learning. They're already learning, and they're learning without the conscious choice to learn. Like learning is just happening all the time.
It's a byproduct of living.
It's a byproduct of living. And so when it comes to things like reading and writing and math and that kind of stuff, a lot of my learning actually happened on accident, just through life, because it's around and you can't help it. It just happens through exposure. You see that symbol enough times, you're going to recognize it. And then you're going to be like, what's that symbol stand for? And someone's going to tell you, and then you're going to know. That happens naturally and gradually. And then there's certain points where something grabs your interest particularly, and then you'll maybe pursue that for a while. Maybe you'll lose interest. So that's how it would go for me. Is like, I feel like I grew in lots of different directions at lots of different times, and would go in this direction for a minute and then backtrack, or then go in another direction. I'd pick up this thing and then realize that wasn't the thing I was really interested in. So that was happening all the time without the conscious thought process necessarily behind it. But to answer the actual question, yes, reading and writing. I was a little bit older. So there was a lot of negative influence from my dad's side of the family. There was a lot of pressure and a lot of negative influence. And it had some negative impacts on us as kids. And I remember, I actually have specific memories I've written about interactions I've had with like my grandma and stuff that made me self-conscious. And she made me worry about myself and if I was going to be okay, like not going to school, because she would ask these questions, and she would interrogate me when my brothers were out of the room, and flashcards, and be like trying to teach me and like testing me on stuff. And it came from her own fear because she loved us, which I understand, but it still had a really negative impact on us. And so my oldest brother had it the worst because he was the first grandchild on both sides of the family. And my mom just did everything opposite of everyone wanted her to do. It was like, no, we're doing like attachment parenting and breastfeed. It was like all this more natural, peaceful parenting kind of stuff that my dad's family just had they just were horrified. They thought we would be dependent and socially awkward and stupid and like all this stuff. They were terrified. So there was this negative influence. So I like to point that out just because my oldest brother, he didn't start reading, I think, until he was about 12 because he was so freaked out from the family pressure that he was exposed to and the fear mongering from them that he would get really nervous around anything academic because they made it seem really scary. And so my mom was just like tried to give him as much space and freedom and remind him that he's absolutely brilliant and fine and he's going to be fine and wonderful. But it's really hard when people that you know and love and trust, like your own grandparents, look at you like something's wrong and they don't trust that you're going to be okay. You start to question if you're going to be okay. And so he had a little bit of a harder time with that. But then my second brother, he was the opposite. He started reading at like 4 or 5 years old. And it was just because he wanted to read this one story in this one book. And he sat my mom down one afternoon and they spent like a couple of hours and that was it. It was like, I want to read this story. And it wasn't, I want to learn how to read. It was, I want to read this story. And my mom had this really beautiful way of allowing us to show her how we wanted to learn as well. Not just what and when, but how. She would approach the really more like letting the questions come from us. So it was very child-led in the sense that she wouldn't just be like, oh, you want to learn how to read? This is how you learn how to read. She's like, really? How do you want to learn? Like, do you want to learn the sounds first? Do you want to learn how to read? Like, it was like, she would kind of investigate that with us. What was our interest really? Because sometimes a child has an interest in something for a reason that you haven't anticipated, and it's coming from some other interest, or it's just one aspect of it that they're interested in. And so if you can follow that drive, it'll go a lot further than if you impose your own ideas about what that interest holds for them or why they're learning that thing. So my second oldest brother, he learned how to read very, very quickly in like one afternoon, one story. And then my oldest brother, it kind of makes sense now seeing them as adults, because he's more like physical and works with his hands. Like he's a sailor, he's a captain, and runs a charter company and sails boats and likes to build things with his hands. And he just remodeled his whole house and that kind of thing. My second oldest brother is like a computer nerd, works for some startup tech company and has a degree in political science. And he's like the brain. So it's interesting to see that later on in life. When we were kids, Garrett was busy building things and Clay was reading, and I was making pretty things and arts and crafts, and Kai was making snacks. Like he became a chef. Like we all had the seeds of our true passions in us all along, but we explored various avenues and aspects of that. So then when I learned how to read, I tried really young, but I was the kind of kid that was like, if I couldn't get it right away, I'd get frustrated and walk away from it. And luckily I was allowed to do that. So I remember pretty young, I want to learn how to read. Okay, let's do it. This is how do you want to do this thing? And then I'd just be like, this is too hard. I don't want to do it. Like I would just walk away. My mom was like, okay, well, whatever. And I was also really busy with my other interests. I was very much into creating tiny things, whatever it was. I was into sewing and fashion design and making clothes for my dolls and building fairy houses in the woods. And I was really into nature, really into plants, edible plants. My mom got me an herbalism class. I had all these other interests going on. And then when I was about 10 or 11, I decided I wanted to read a whole book by myself. And I read Jonathan Livingston Seagull. I struggled through it and I was like, okay, but I did it, but I don't really want to do that again right now. So then maybe a year or so later, my friend recommended that I read Harry Potter. And I didn't want to tell my friend, well, I can't read, I don't want to read or whatever. And so my mom started reading it out loud to us, and I got so involved in the story. And then my little brother was like, well, I want to know what happens. And he started reading. And that's how he learned how to read as well. He was like 9. He started reading Harry Potter, and then I started reading Harry Potter because I was like, there's no way he's going to get ahead in the story. And I don't want to wait for my mom to read out loud to me. So I basically grabbed that book and sat down on the couch and made myself sit there. I was like, I'm going to do this. So there was that decision and that determination. But I had already had so many years of exposure to reading. My mom read to us all the time and was always involved and present and answering questions and all that. So I had already these years of being exposed to reading and letters and words and looking at pages while they're being read and then trying to read myself on occasion. So it happened in several batches of learning over the years. And then the final push was just Harry Potter. I sat down and it took me about an hour or two at that point till I was reading super fluently, and something just clicked in my brain. And then I was just like, I couldn't believe it. It was the most thrilling experience. I was just overcome. I felt like I would describe it now. I felt like I discovered some new amazing drug. I was just like, this is amazing. And I devoured it. I read Harry Potter in 2 days. And then I read the second book in 2 or 3 days. And it just went like that. I read probably at least 6 hours a day, if not more, for a couple of years there. And my mom would have to be like, honey, you might want to move your body. You might want to get up and go outside for a minute. And she had to kind of help me, because I became really sedentary and just obsessed with fantasy novels. And then I read so many things. I fell in love with Shakespeare. I read every Shakespeare play ever written, just because I loved them on my own. And then I found out later, as a teenager, that people are forced to read that stuff in school and they hate it. And so I read a lot of classic literature, and I loved language and words and writing. And it was just this beautiful, magical thing. And so when I hear people concerned about their kids learning how to read, I'm always like, that is the last thing I would worry about, because I feel like it's this absolute amazing magical thing. Everyone's going to want to crack that code at some point, because it grants you this independence. And children, naturally crave independence. I mean, you see them, they kind of go back and forth. And as they get older, they want more and more independence. No, I want to do it myself. No, I want to get my own thing. No, I want to do this. I want to, like they want independence from you. And all of these skills that we're talking about, all these academic skills, those all grant independence. So at some point they're going to want it, because they're not going to want, what kid is going to want to be 12, 13 years old sitting in a restaurant and have you read the menu to them? They don't want that. They don't want to be dependent. They want independence. They want to be able to do it themselves.
So I want to pause there for two things that you said there that really stuck out to me. So first of all, I know that when kids they wait until there's that motivation, there's that thing that they want to achieve, and they need this and this and this, criteria. These things have to be met before that they can do the thing, right?
Yeah.
Like they have to know how to add, or whatever the skill is. And so I've heard this over and over again with unschoolers and home educators in general, that when that happens, the thing that they need to learn, that skill, is so rapidly achieved because it's what's holding them back from getting to their goal.
Yeah, there's a driving force behind it that's just unstoppable.
Yeah, and what's interesting to me is that we spend years teaching kids how to read sometimes, and then practicing it over and over again. And that could have all been avoided, that, that time spent, that time wasted sitting and doing these drills and practice and worksheets and, reading out loud in groups, and all of that stuff could have been completely avoided if you just waited until that spark came intrinsically, right?
Yeah, because it will. And I think that's the problem, is that a lot of people, they don't trust that. They don't believe. And I think it comes down to like your basic beliefs about human nature and what a human being is born with. And I believe that they're born with this evolving spirit. They don't want to be stagnant and sedentary. Like, no human being is born lazy. It's just not a thing. It's like they learn how to walk and talk. Like, you couldn't stop them if you wanted to. And without the psychological blocks that get built throughout life, like, it would just continue that way. And I feel like, yeah, every child who grows up in a healthy, supportive environment is going to find a personal reason to learn these things that they need, because they're going to be needed. So that's the other thing I think is funny, is that people are like, well, they need to learn these things. And I'm like, well, if they need to learn them, then they will. You're saying need. Need means it's actually necessary, which means they won't be able to avoid it. You're kind of contradicting yourself if you think you need to force someone to learn something that's needed, because if it's needed for them, they will learn it. You will acquire these tools that you need to live your own life, because who doesn't want that? And then people are like, well, if you're really afraid of like your 30-year-old son living in your basement and never doing anything, I think that's what people are afraid of. They're afraid their kids are going to amount to nothing, and they're going to be dependent forever, and they're just going to sit around and be lazy. I just don't really get that, because I don't see anyone that's been raised like this that's ended up that way. I see a lot of people in public school. Like, I see that our system pumping out people who don't know how to live their own life. We have this massive homeless population in our country. We have the amount of medical, like psychological problems that we have, mental illness, like all these things. And yet we're still like trusting in the system that is creating that. And I'm not saying that school alone, I'm talking about the whole system that school is a part of. I don't know. Like, to me, I'm like, there's no guarantee. You send your kid to school, like they still might end up this other way, like unhappy and broken and depressed and all these things. So why would you keep, like, there's no guarantee in school. So why do you feel so much safer? And I wonder why we're not changing how we're raising children, because that's where it starts to me. Like, that's where it starts. Like, you want a healthy human, you start from infancy. And it's about protecting their emotional and mental state, because that's what's going to cause them to be successful. You can know all the math and all the science and all the English in the whole world. Like, you can be so highly educated and you can still be a miserable, awful person who treats people like crap, who hates the world, who locks himself away. Like, education doesn't have anything to do with with joy and happiness and passion and love and health and wellness. So I think like it's interesting that we still focus on these things instead of like, let's take care of the real problem here, which is like our psychological, emotional health and well-being. And I feel like the academic stuff will take care of itself. Because if you're healthy psychologically and emotionally, then you want to thrive and be happy. And so you will acquire those skills that you need to do that.
I think it's about, like we talked about before, if you don't feel happy within yourself, you can't live a happy life. Like,
Yeah. Fulfilling, satisfying. Yeah.
it really starts there.
Yeah.
And I wanted to switch gears just a little bit because I know people are going to be interested about how your lifestyle was, like more about what kind of learning resources did you have in your home? What sort of things did you guys do? And let's talk a little bit about strewing because I know you have an opinion about that. And I'm very eager to hear it because I like bringing on different perspectives and hearing different people's opinions. So
yeah. Well, the strewing thing is very simple. It's actually only something I really heard about recently, but it's very simple. It's just what we talked about earlier, is that anytime you have an agenda and you're trying to manipulate your child, it's going to backfire. I feel like this consciously strewing, like I'm going to leave this here so that my kid might get interested, so that they might learn and be successful someday. It's all coming from fear. And it's still to me a manipulative behavior. Now there's nothing wrong with like, oh, you see a book, when you're out and about that day and you're like, oh, I think, my kid might really like that book, and you grab it and then you leave it on the coffee table when you get home. And that's like, that happens, if it happens naturally, just from because that's what's happening in your life and you saw this thing and it reminded you of this person and so you got it for them, that's its own thing. But if you're purposefully with this agenda to get your kids to learn and you're like purposefully leaving things in their way, to me, it's just another manipulative behavior, because I would not appreciate if my mom was doing that to me. I would not appreciate that if my boyfriend was doing that to me. I wouldn't do that to my boyfriend. If I want him to be educated about something, I'm not going to be like, oh, I'll just leave this book here and he might see it and then maybe he'll get interested and then we can have this conversation. Like, that's really disrespectful. I would feel like that's really disrespectful if someone did that to me. I'd be like, why didn't you just talk to me about it? Why didn't you just show me the book when you saw it?
It's about intentionality.
It's about intentionality. It's the same thing as what I was talking about before. It's not necessarily the action. It's about where that action is coming from. So if my mom comes home and leaves a book on the table, she's like, oh yeah, I just saw this, I thought you might like it. I'm like, oh cool, thanks mom. Like that's a thing. Like I can feel where she's coming from with that. But if she like does it like sneaky and she's like doing it like secretly in her own head and not telling me about it and like leaving things for me to find so that I might to try and change me, because that's what it's about. It's like anytime you're trying to like change your child or make them a certain way or get them interested in a certain thing, like to me, that's manipulative behavior. And that's in any relationship. That's not just children. And so I like to take like these things that we take for granted in adult relationships and apply them to children. How would you feel if your partner was treating you the way that you treat your children? And so there's nothing wrong with strewing in and of itself. I really encourage all parents to just question where they're coming from every time they do or say something like that. Don't just take the first answer that pops up in your head. Like, I mean, really dig into it. Why did I say that? Where is that coming from? Sit with yourself and look into that. And that's all part of the deschooling process. Why did I say that? What did I want from my child in that moment? What response was I trying to elicit? And when fear comes up, like the thought, like, oh, they're not gonna, question that thought. Like, why, where did this thought come from? Where did I get this idea and why do I believe it? And question if it's true for you. And so the thing with the strewing is, to me, it's just like any other kind of method that we get this idea in our head and then we believe it. And then we're trying to like use this method on our children to manipulate them into being a certain way, instead of just sharing something from joy and love, which could happen naturally without this psychological process of, I'm going to do this thing so that they'll see it, so that they'll have this, so that it'll have this effect, and then they'll be like this.
Mm-hmm.
So it's kind of hard to describe because to me, it's not necessarily about the action. It's about the process behind it and the cause and where it's coming from.
Right.
Adults are extremely manipulative toward children without realizing it, unconsciously all the time. And sometimes they'll be like, well, no, I'm doing this because I love them. And I'm like, yes, but let's look a little bit deeper, because that's an easy answer. And oftentimes it's a little harder to get to the truth. So don't always accept, that first answer. Like, sit with the question and like let it dig into you and show you what's really going on.
Yeah, I want to get to this question, and we're going on, almost 2 hours. So I want to be respectful of your time. I think I'm going to have you back on because we have so many topics to cover, but I definitely want to talk about this one. So please explain to me a little bit about how your mom handled boundaries in your home, because I think as unschooling parents, some people take it to an extreme
where there's like no guidelines or house rules, or like it's like
right.
the kids are become dictators, and it's just like all over everything, anytime, anywhere, whatever you want, and there's no kind of structure to like the household. Yeah, I've seen that.
Right. And you talked about living harmoniously and peacefully and joyfully.
Yes.
And
Yes.
to me, when I first started this journey and started reading about these parenting styles within the unschooling community, it occurred to me that wasn't going to work for me, because I do value peace and harmony.
Yeah.
And that doesn't seem to coincide with having boundaries, right? And being able to live communally.
Well, a lot of people assume, like I remember when I was younger too, and like my mom would talk to people, and it was all about like, to her, it's all about freedom. And people would assume that we just had this chaotic household, food fights and up all night. And, like, who knows what they were thinking? Like, just insanity and absolute chaos. That's not how it was at all. And this is where it comes down to like, my mom is, she really operates from the heart and from her intuition and her gut. And so it wasn't as much of a psychological process for her, which I think is really, really beautiful, because then she didn't have quite so much in the way. She wasn't trying to follow someone else's model. She was really like making it up as she went along. And she was very clear about that with us. So it was really, we operated, see, equality goes both ways and respect goes both ways. So oftentimes what I'm seeing is people in an effort to allow their children freedom, they're giving up their own freedom. And that's not freedom, because anytime that someone's freedom is being sacrificed to another person's freedom, then that's not true freedom. My mom had this beautiful way of somehow finding this balance of like where all of our freedoms curbed each other's freedoms, like where do those freedoms meet and affect one another. And so that's really interesting. And it's difficult to explain sometimes, but I like to explain it in the sense that like, we didn't always have physical freedom, because you can't just do whatever you want. Like you can't, like I heard recently about an unschooling mom who was struggling because her two sons were just tearing up the house and like destroyed the couches, and she was living in a rental, and they like broke a wall and like all this stuff. But she's like, but I'm trying to unschool and let them be free and all this stuff. And I was like, has nothing to do with unschooling, actually. It has nothing to do with unschooling. In my family, we really operated like a small tribe, like a democratic household, where we would sit and discuss things together, and we would all be part of the decision-making process. And we would all have to make adjustments and sacrifices for each other. So it wasn't like my mom was this dictator. Like when there's equality, it means that not one is above the other. So our freedom was not more or less important than hers. She had this beautiful way of kind of being that facilitator, and it always made sense. And she was always willing to hear us out and our concerns and considerations, and to change and adjust and grow. And we tried so many different things, it was kind of like we all had to help out with the chores. That's kind of how it works. And when you're living in any community, you don't just get to leave your dishes in the sink. Like everyone has to do their part and clean up after themselves. It's not fair to leave that all on one person. So we worked out so many different ways, like there was a time when mom would make a list and we'd all sign up for the chores that we wanted. There was a time when we tried us all doing our chores in the morning. There was a time when we tried doing them at different times of the day. There was a time when we tried rotating. We tried so many things to find what worked for us. So it wasn't just like she would make up these rules and implement them. It was very much like we were all figuring it out together all the time. And it was all about how can we live in peace and harmony together. So that's what came first, was the peace and harmony of our home. And there was very few times in my life that I can remember my mom like putting her foot down, and I feel like she was totally justified and it made sense to us and we respected it.
Yeah, I think the difference is the top-down approach. Do you know what I mean? Like
Yeah.
it was more like, and we've had those similar conversations in our family a million times. Like, okay, it was working, but now it's not. Let's see how can we change it? Because I still feel like I'm being burdened more than the rest, or, you know, whatever it is.
Yeah. No, you constantly have to be willing to change and evolve, because especially with children, because they are developing so quickly that it's going to be changing and evolving all the time. And you're never going to come to this place where you're like, okay, we've got it now. It's like, it's an ever evolving, growing thing. It's like a garden, and you don't get to just stop, and it never like ends and is stagnant. And you just like, we found the way. It's like everyone's different, and every combination of people is different. So every family is going to have to kind of find that way that works for them. But we had like routine, and we found the things that worked for us. And it was really beautiful, a happy, peaceful childhood is how I remember it. And my mom, it was only a few times really that she had like certain things that she would put her foot down about. And that had to do with when it came to like protecting our health and well-being. And when she felt like something was harmful or dangerous was the only time that she would really step in and like kind of pull the mom card. And I'm super grateful that she did. Like, I feel that that's a parent's job, is to protect their child so that their child can develop according to their own natural instincts and brain development, you know. But there are certain things that get introduced that can alter that can affect a child's natural brain development in negative ways. And my mom felt that was her job, to step in and prevent that, so that we were allowed to develop freely and naturally.
Can you give an example?
Well, you know, yes, but I also don't want to be like judgmental of other people who feel that those aren't harmful, because everyone's a little bit different.
Well, no, but just for your own life experience, like, what was the moment that you remember?
Yeah, we didn't have video games. And that's like people are, you know, the screen time thing is a really controversial topic. And I don't usually talk about it a ton, because I feel like it's something everyone kind of has to discover for themselves if it works for them or not. And some people are doing fine with the unlimited screen time, and that's fine. But in my childhood, also, it's very different. Like 30 years ago, technology was very different. So we didn't have like the handheld devices and stuff. So it's like a different game now. My mom actually threw out the TV when I was little. She just saw the effect it had on my brothers. And she was like, this makes you guys so weird and uncomfortable and aggro. And like, she's like, why am I even doing this? So to her, again, it wasn't like a psychological process of if this is good or bad, or if I should let them because of this and that and the other. And it wasn't like that. It was really just like her mother's intuition stepped in and was like, this is having a really negative effect on my children. And they were at that age where it wasn't like you had a conversation about it, you know, 2-3 years old. And it was just like, we're just not going to have TV. And so we didn't have TV. And then when I was a little bit older, we did movies and documentaries and stuff. And we worked that out as a family, like how much and when and that kind of thing. So it was another one of those things that we discussed all together. And then there was a time when my brothers were going to their friends to play video games. And my mom was not going to say they couldn't do it when they weren't in the house. You know, like she had this really cool way of saying like, this is our community space and we need to do what works best for everyone in this space. Outside of this space, you're a free, sovereign individual, you know?
Right.
So within this space though, like we do have guidelines and rules for what works for everyone. It's kind of like, you know, the Democratic Free School, Summerhill. I remember watching the movie. It's a great movie, by the way. Summerhill, the movie. And there's this scene where they're like, they make up rules together as a school. And one of them was like, you can't skateboard inside because someone got a splinter in their foot. And I was like, yeah, that's basically how my family worked. It was like, no, we don't do video games in this house, because then Garrett and Clay, if they play video games, they become mean and nasty and they treat Kai and I really poorly. And that's not okay. And so it was like, that's not okay in this house. And mom also, and this is where it gets really hard to have this conversation sometimes, because it's so easily misunderstood. And I have a hard time communicating it properly. But there's things that my mom just didn't support, and that was one of them. So she wasn't going to buy us something that she felt was unhealthy and she didn't want around herself. So she just didn't support it. She didn't take it away. We never had it in the first place. And they went and played video games with their friends, and that was okay for a little bit. And then they would come home really angry and unkind to me and my younger brother, which like broke my heart. I remember this because they were the most wonderful big brothers. And they would come home and it was awful. And then my mom would be upset. And I remember her crying in front of them and telling them, like, this is really painful for me to see you like this. And I don't want to be around you when you're acting like this. And Summer and Kai don't want to be around you when you're like this. And we're hurt and we love you and we miss you. And if you want to play video games, then just don't come home for an hour or so afterwards so that you can detox and be yourself when you get home. And that's what we worked out, actually. And they agreed to that. So I think everyone has to find the different things that work for them. And nowadays, you know, like people are talking about how much there's so much educational value in screen times and video games. And I don't argue that. Of course there is. But that doesn't mean that everyone needs to do unlimited screen time. It doesn't mean that it's healthy or safe. It doesn't mean that it's not. I'm not saying one way or the other. I just know that it did not work for my family. And then when we got a little bit older, we did get a computer when internet came out. We got a computer and internet, and we all figured out how to use and share that time and use internet to research things and watch cool videos. And the educational resources online now are absolutely amazing. I use them a lot myself. We were a low-tech family, low-tech lifestyle because that's what worked for us. And my mom, it was all about whatever supported the peace and harmony of the home. So whatever was disruptive to that got investigated and then thrown out or not, depending on the outcome of our family investigation into that thing. And then, you know, my mom was a super, super health nut. So there was things that she wouldn't buy for us. And also she was really, really passionate about animal cruelty. And so there was things she wouldn't buy because they participated in that. And she's like, I'm not going to contribute. You can raise your own money and buy that if you want, you know? So that's kind of where the freedom comes in between the parent and the child. Is like, I really do feel that a parent has the freedom to say, I don't support this and I don't want to participate in this. But that doesn't mean that you can force your child not to if they find the means to do that on their own. So that's kind of an interesting and different thing. I watched a video with an unschooling mom who was like, she made a video of her and her son, and she was going into a McDonald's to buy her son a hamburger. And she was like, I'm vegetarian. I don't eat meat and I don't believe in McDonald's. But this is what my child wants. So I'm going to do it for him because he's free. And I was like, yeah, he is free, but you are also free to say, honey, I don't want to go into McDonald's and buy that hamburger for you. So you can figure out a way to do that on your own. Like, there's freedom goes both ways and equality goes both ways. And your child is free to not like that. You know, they're free to be upset about it. So it's a really hard thing to explain because to me, it's kind of more energetic and emotional, like how that works and that communication and that relationship. And with my mom and I, like, I never felt like she was encroaching on my freedom. I felt like she was standing up for herself. And I learned how to do the same from seeing her do that. So like, she set this example of being strong and staying committed to her convictions and holding to her principles without imposing them on us. And so I also learned how to do that, like how to stand up for myself and say, this doesn't feel right for me. I don't support this. I don't want to be involved in this, but without imposing it on other people. That's how she was with everything. And I think that was just super, super beautiful. And there were times where it was like, if she didn't want to buy factory farm meat, and it was like, she didn't just say no. She was like, this is why. And she would be like, if you want to know why I feel this way, this is why. And she took us to an animal sanctuary and we watched videos of factory farming, and we all were like, yep, that's right. We don't want to be part of that either, Mom. Thanks. You know? So she always explained her position and made it clear. And also was like, you know, like with the video games, or like, I'm sorry, I don't want to participate in this. And I don't want to support you in something that I feel is harming you, but you're free to do as you please. I just don't want to be part of it. And we respected her for that. I feel like that was one of the things that earned my respect immensely, was her being her own independent, sovereign being and allowing us to do the same. and finding that balance and that line where you're not crossing into each other's space and trying to control each other, but you're also staying true to yourself and your own beliefs and your own convictions.
Then also, if you do, then you go back and have a discussion about how you are sorry about it.
Oh, absolutely. My mom had an immense amount of humility. She was very vulnerable with us and very open and very honest, and always. And sometimes she would be like, yeah, I don't know why I said that earlier, you guys. I'm really sorry. I was just like, whatever. Like, she apologized all the time. And she also would tell us she didn't know what she was doing. We would sit together as a family and she'd be like, guys, I don't know what to do about this. This is really hard for me. Like, what do you think we should do? Like, that was the video game thing. Her being like, this isn't working for everyone. Like, this is really hard for me, and this is painful, and this is how it feels, and this is what I'm seeing in you, and this is what I'm afraid of, and this is, and it was like just this very open, raw, real, honest, vulnerable communication and constant humility of being like, I don't know how to deal with this. Help me out here. Let's do this together. And not being like she always had all the answers. And then being willing to change it too. Get changed a little while down the road. I think my little brother got like one of those handheld video gamey things when he was, I don't know, we were a little older. I think my older brothers had moved out and stuff, and we had a different thing. So it wasn't always like never any video games in the house. It was just like we were constantly finding what worked for us and how to function together as a family. And I think that's really important, that you never come to this place where you're so attached to things being a certain way that you're not willing to change them for the better.
I think the best way to wrap up this conversation is back to sort of where we began, with the fact that it really starts with relationships, like relationships with yourself, relationships with each other, because if you are staying in tune with that, like if that is in balance, that should be your guiding light. There's no book or, structured rules that are going to work for every single family. You are unique. Your family is unique. But if you're feeling like everything is harmonious within your family group, then you're probably doing all right. Like that's a good sign.
I've told a lot of moms, like, you take care of the relationship and the rest will take care of itself. And I don't feel like it's a choice between sacrificing, academic learning for the relationship or sacrificing it. But I do feel like people are sacrificing their connection, their relationship with their child for academic learning. But I feel like if you take care of the relationship and the connection and your child's emotional and psychological well-being, the academic learning will take care of itself. It doesn't really need you to manage it. It just needs you to be available and willing. But it really doesn't even need you to know that it's happening. Like, learning does not require your attention. I mean, your child's learning doesn't require your attention. In that sense, like, it doesn't need you to know that it's happening or to focus on it or to monitor it or like keep track of it or anything like that. It can happen without you knowing anything about it. And all it really needs is that connection, that relationship with you, because then your children feel safe to come to you and ask you these questions, which is how they learn, and sit down with you and let you teach them something that they're interested in because they feel safe and they trust you. And so if you have that connection, that trust, and that mutual respect, then they'll be fine. They'll learn everything they need to learn because they'll have that security and they'll have that safety, and you can go anywhere from there.
I think that's a great way to wrap it up. That is that is such a great last word. I love it. Before you go, though, I have 4 questions that I ask every guest on the show. Would you be open to answering them?
Sure.
Okay. So the first question is, what are you curious about right now? Like, what are you digging into?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, I'm always curious about my glass blowing. I was blowing glass all day yesterday. I made a whole bunch of big pieces and I was experimenting with a whole new color and design pattern. So I'm very curious to see how those turn out. I don't get to pick them up until this afternoon. But right now, I'm also really into my garden, and I'm building a chicken coop. So I'm learning about chickens and how to keep chickens. So that's been fun. And my neighbor is having a baby, and she's a good friend of mine. So I'm actually learning a bit more about that whole process, pregnancy and birthing. And I've always been fascinated about that. And I am midwifery and doula and that kind of stuff.
That is my number one, well, I guess number two passion aside from education. I am like obsessed with the birth process. So anyway, second question, what is your favorite way to learn, or how do you like to learn?
I really don't know how to answer that question, because I feel like I learn in so many different ways and sometimes unconsciously. But primarily, like if I'm going to learn something on purpose consciously, I think I'm mostly a visual type of learner. I like to be shown, and then I like to try it myself.
I think that's so funny. A lot of people say that, like that's a hard question to answer. But I think that just is that comes from unschoolers. Like, I don't think everybody would answer that way. So I always kind of like grimace and like laugh a little bit internally when I hear people be like, that is such a hard question. I'm like, only an unschooler, I think, would say that.
Yeah, it really is, because I think that we weren't told that we had to have a certain way to learn either. So like a lot of people will grow up in the school system and they get this idea that they learn a certain way. And unschoolers oftentimes were like, I don't know, I just learn stuff.
So again, I'm very sorry about that abrupt ending to the interview. I just wanted to say that I am so grateful that Summer joined us on the show today and gave us so much food for thought, so many things to think about and consider in our families. And also, I wanted to tell you how you can connect with her if you have any questions or want to, reach out to her directly. You can find her on Facebook at This Beautiful Living Freedom, or she has a website for her glass art. It's called mermaidartglass.com. So thanks again for joining me, Summer, and I look forward to talking to you again in the future. Bye-bye. Thanks for listening to the Rogue Learner podcast. If you're enjoying the show, please take a moment to hit subscribe and leave a review. Reviews are the best way to support the show and allow me to create new episodes. If you're looking for amazing learning resources, you can check out the Rogue Learner website at roguelearner.com, where you'll find a free directory of podcasts, apps, websites, curriculum, and online courses for your kids. For even more support, you can join our Rogue Learner Facebook group. You'll find that link on our homepage at roguelearner.com. I hope to see you all next week. And until then, remember, let curiosity lead the learning.